Hi, everyone. We are so glad you could join us. Thank you so much for dropping your names and locations in the chat. I'm seeing lots of familiar folks out there. So hello to you all. And hello to the folks we haven't met yet. We're really excited you could join us today. I'm Jackie Devine. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the head of research at NOVA. So we are really thrilled to have some members of the research team here today to talk about DEI data. If you can't measure it, you can't change it. So let's jump right in. We would love to start just by introducing ourselves so you know who's kind of part of the conversation today. As I said, I'm Jackie. I'm the head of research at NOVA. I've been with NOVA for about 5 years now, and I'm really excited about the research program we've built. We kind of said, this is a thing that really needs to happen. Companies, organizations need data. You need to understand what's going on in your organization. You need to understand what's going on with your stakeholders. So this is an area where we really have built up an exceptional research program, and we're so proud to be able to share that with you today. So I'll pass it off to my colleague Angela to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Lynn, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the data scientist at NOVA. I've been working here for over 2 years now, and time really has flown by, but my interests especially are in quantitative data. So really happy to lend that lens here today. That is something I've just always thrived and lived in. My background has always been in statistics, research, and just a lot of numbers. So really excited about the topic. And so I'll pass it off to Brandale.
Of course, you would think that I would have the mute, unmute down by now, but but hello, everybody. My name is Brandale Mills-Cox. I've been a part of the NOVA team for almost a year now. I'm super excited to be engaging in this conversation today. My background comes from DEI space and researching primarily communities of color and their experiences. So this topic is something that's absolutely near and dear to my heart. So I look forward to uncovering some good discussion today.
Great. So those of you who have worked with us before know that the research team is a small group within a much larger group of folks who are really committed to working with organizations to build DEI programming and to really just build inclusivity and help promote healthy organizational culture. So here is the NOVA team. We are distributed all over the world. We've got folks working in lots of different areas of DEI. We've got specialists who can help you with very specific things. But overall, kind of our 3 top pillars of the work that we do. Our work falls into learning and development, where in this, too far, in the learning and development space. We've got out-of-the-box content, so we provide e-learning, but we also have virtual and in-person programming. We're really known for exceptional facilitation. We've got a really great group of folks who do both virtual on Zoom like this and in-person learning sessions around all kinds of topics. We don't do the traditional diversity training like multicolored hands in a circle. That's really never been what NOVA is all about. We approach learning from a real professional development standpoint and building core competencies for your workforce. In research and data analytics, that's what we're here to talk about today. We really take a mixed methods approach. So, as you can see, Angela works on the quant side, Brandale works on the qual side. We really combine both of these types of research to build insights that are useful for the teams that we are working with. So we ground our work in the social identity model, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And we really try to get a nuanced understanding of what's happening within the groups that we're working with. And then finally, strategy and consulting. So, NOVA does a lot of work with organizations to really help deliver on programming, deliver on your goals. We've got expertise in a lot of different areas around DEI. And so, whatever your goals are, we've got folks who can help with that in the strategy and consulting space. So I'll pass it off to Brandale to talk a little bit about our program today.
So today we're gonna obviously talk about research. Something we're all very passionate about, but specifically how we can use research as a tool of storytelling and to really be able to walk away with a comprehensive understanding of how we can use data to emphasize the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to tell the experiences of those marginalized communities. We'll be diving in on specific ways that you can use DEI data, specifically without just checking a box, without just relying on the quota, and how we approach data analysis as critical scholars, as scholars who are really looking at data as a means to, again, provide a voice for those marginalized communities. So ways that you can analyze data just from that perspective. So I will go ahead and kick it over to Angela.
And so before we start all that, we want to set some groundwork. So these are just 3 questions we have. I think you've already heard some of the answers, but for one, why are we doing this? We're all so passionate about this topic. All 3 of us work in data in a few different ways, but we all really care about this DEI work as well. And so in ways you can participate today, I think we've already seen the chat is open and everyone can see your comments, or you can also send private comments to the hosts and panelists. We'd love for you to engage while we are just having this conversation. And so with that also, if you would like to opt into live transcripts or live captioning, there is that option, I believe, at the bottom of your screen. I think on my screen, it's under more and then captions, but you can opt in as well if you'd like to turn those on. And so what should we all know going in? There's not much. I think you're all here because you are interested in this topic and care about it. We just want to state that this session isn't about us presenting the perfect answer or even the answer to any of the questions that we have. We are here to have a conversation. We're also here to really co-share knowledge across this work. And so we'd love to hear from you as well. We'd love to continue to iterate and see what our approaches are looking like and sounding like in your own spaces as well. So we'd love to hear from you. And so we're pretty much just hoping that everyone can come in and take a few pieces from hearing Jackie, Brandale, and I talk about data for the next hour and a half, but also reflect on how this applies in your work. And we'd love to hear from you as well. And so I think that pretty much starts for all of our basic groundwork for today. And if you have any questions, you can also message us in the chat. And so, okay, we'll go on to the next. We have a little bit of an opening question for you all. The chat is open. And so for this, we'd love to hear what's one thing in the DEI space someone has told you you can't measure that. So we know we've heard this a number of times. And so we'd like you to think about where have you heard this before and what context? And I'll let you start populating the chat with some items. I already see a few here. Sense of belonging and inclusion. Yes, yes. Oh my goodness, I see a lot coming in. So to read off a few too, how effective is the work you're doing? Learning growth around topics. I see themes about belonging, tracking, measuring goals and improvements along the way. Items about equity, burnout. You can't measure knowledge and competency across an institution. And we see more things about impact as well. I love that. Flip a little bit longer, but I do see another new one of leadership buy-in.
I'm going to pull the question down here so you can see our lovely faces again, because we really want to talk about this. So you all have posted a lot of really great stuff in the chat that someone along the line has told you you can't measure that, right? We hear this all the time too. And really our perspective at NOVA is that, first of all, you can measure it. You just have to get a little bit creative. And second of all, that really the measurement piece is so important, which is the topic of our webinar today. If you don't measure it, you can't change it because you really don't know where you are and you don't know where you want to go. And until you can get those 2 pieces of information in place, making change is really tough within an organization. So, when people say you can't measure inclusion, you can't measure belonging, you can't measure equity, our approach is really to say, yes, you can. And let's talk about how. Let's talk about what that looks like in your organization. And so typically, we really take a behavioral measurement approach to this work and say, okay, if inclusion is happening in your organization, for example, let's talk inclusion. if this is happening, what does it look like? What else is happening? What are people saying? What are people doing? What are people not doing? And how can we put metrics and put parameters around that? How will we know if this is happening? Where are those behaviors happening? How can we observe those behaviors happening? And really think about custom approaches in your particular organization to measure these constructs that seem like they're totally insurmountable to measure. So for us, that's really central to everything that we do with data and DEI, is that you've got to measure it, because that's really the only way that you can bring measurable change to your organization. Now, Brandel, you mentioned a moment ago, like, let's talk about data storytelling and why that is so important. And I think these topics are these really go hand in hand, right? Because if you're collecting all this data, you're measuring things, you want to change things, but talk to me about the storytelling piece. How does that play into this?
Absolutely. I have this running joke where I tell people that anytime you want somebody to believe something, you can say, well, the research says, or studies have shown. And I think that is such a good illustration, just to show that research can really validate people's experiences, right? It can really tell a comprehensive story of what people are experiencing, right? A lot of you mentioned in the chat that you heard that you can't measure things like inclusion and belonging, but data can absolutely do that, right? It can tell us what people are feeling, what people are experiencing. It allows us to really kind of understand those experiences that we might not necessarily connect directly to. We might not have direct experience in that. And so research gives us perspective. It gives us insight into what other people are experiencing and feeling, and how they're navigating in the world through their eyes and through their perspective. And so research is really a solid foundation, and a great foundation just in terms of being able to tell the story of different people, being able to tell the story of inclusion, for example. Let's take inclusion. So if I'm an individual and I'm in a workplace where I'm the only one who looks like me or has the same cultural background as me, my experience obviously will differ from my colleagues, but the data, be it collected through quantitative or qualitative, can really help someone outside of my position really truly understand what my perspective is. And then from there, being able to build a culture of inclusion to where I can walk into my place of work and feel welcome, feel seen, and feel validated. And so data is really just the foundation to being able to allow us to build on that, to build these cultures of inclusion and acceptance and belonging for individuals.
I think with that, Brent, yeah, I was gonna say too, like what I hear too is like you can't measure that for what you were just talking about, inclusion. But when you also pose the question of like, what have you been hearing from either people that work at your organization or your workspace, and they do have a sense of maybe where that landscape is, that's data right there to me. Like to me, like the fact that you're saying you can't measure it can't be true, because you definitely have a sense of maybe where it's landing right now. And so
absolutely, Angela. And it also helps us be able to kind of predict trends and themes, right? And be able to address those themes and be able to make changes within to ensure that those experiences, if they're negative experiences, that they don't continue to happen.
Absolutely. I kind of latched onto, when we're thinking about the chat and all these things that people say that they can't change. I really appreciated Beth's comment, how effective is the work you're doing? And Kieran saying the impact of ERGs. I mean, these are people who are looking for you to prove ROI, right? That's the root of questions like that when you're hearing that in your workplace. Which is a really hard thing to do, right? Because diversity and inclusion, if you're doing it properly, it shouldn't be operating over in a silo where, DEI is the only thing touching this and this and this. And so if we see an impact on that one thing, then it must have been the DEI work, right? If you're doing this right, it's embedded in every single thing that you do. And so that can pose some challenges to, if somebody's looking for strict ROI. But I think part of where this storytelling piece intersects with this, give me the ROI piece, is really looking at that interplay between the qualitative and quantitative data that we're collecting. So Angela, being our resident quant person, can you talk to us a little bit about these two different types of data and how they interact in this research?
Yeah, and I think just the three of us sitting right here is a really good example of that. We all have, again, slightly different lens. I focus more on the quantitative. And just to be clear with what I mean by that, it is more of what you think of with like hard, quote unquote, hard numbers, I would say. So the way I view, just generally, if we were to back up for a second, they're both necessary. You definitely need both qualitative and quantitative data. And in that one example where I'm like, oh, you're hearing from people at your organization about X, that is data. And so the research, of course, we're talking about is a little bit more formalized in that sense, but I see that they're both so necessary, qualitative and quantitative, to really understand people's experiences. So the way I do view it, it is like either simultaneous or a virtual cycle where you can start with one or the other, but you need this other one to iterate. And what I mean by that, in my instance, is for a lot of the quantitative data pieces that I have looked at collecting or analyzing, for example, could be average values of like responses to a certain statement. It could be looking at correlations between two variables, but all of these really set the landscape. And so for me, I look at a number and I set the landscape, but I can't really tell you why that number is there. Like I can't explain it necessarily. And so from there, I need to move into the qualitative data. The qualitative data really sheds that more context and understanding for me to also prioritize, like, what are the next quantitative analyses I need to run? What am I seeing in this qualitative data that can help me inform and understand where my numbers are landing? And then also, what else should I look into and what priorities should I be doing? And so I really think they're both so necessary to understand the landscape. And some of my work I also view as quantitative is like first helping diagnose the problem and identifying the gaps. And then you move over to qualitative and maybe strategizing more on like, what is the underlying reason? Where can we move from here? And one thing I always like to remember about data too, of course, I think it's so useful and integral and important, but it doesn't literally change anything. And so I always want to keep in mind, like, what am I going to do with this data to actually change the numbers underlying it? Just because I've collected and analyzed it isn't going to change it for the next time I want to collect this again. And so these are just a few different pieces. I know, Brando, you have a lot to say also on the qualitative piece. So I'll let you pipe in as well.
Absolutely. And I love that you say that, Angela, because, I was born a qualitative researcher, but lately I've been dabbling in quant a little bit. And I see the value of the two of them being paired together, right? And I really want to focus on just the importance of qualitative data and how it helps us expand on the story of those hard numbers, like you mentioned, right? Quant data, it gives us the numbers, it gives us the statistic, it gives us we can count the variables, but qualitative data really helps us understand the why. It helps us, like I mentioned before, understand those experiences. It really kind of taps into our emotional cord, right? And so it's important to really kind of validate the strength and the qualities that qualitative data brings to the art of storytelling, because it helps expand that understanding of what those numbers bring to the table. And so I really want us to get away from just relying on quantitative data and recognizing that qual is data too. And like I said, when they're paired together, it's a beautiful story. And it's a great way to be able to kind of leverage both perspectives to understand a phenomenon. And so I think, especially in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's important to have those hard numbers, to have that hard data. To Jackie's point, like, a lot of people are so focused on that ROI that sometimes they'll just look at the quantitative data, and as long as they see gains there, then that's fine. But it's also important to factor in those experiences and the why and the feelings and the emotions, because the two combined just will help us be informed in the best practices to make the environment a little bit more inclusive and safer for everyone. And so I think we have to, again, validate the worth of qualitative data, especially when it's combined with quant data.
Yeah, I love that. And, I love the statement too that qualitative data is data. And as researchers, I feel like we kind of like take that for granted because, of course, it's data. But in a lot of the business and corporate settings in which we work, that just seems like, people just haven't quite thought of it that way all the time. And so sometimes having to just like make that case and say, this is real data. There are entire academic fields built around qualitative data. It's real data. And so yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. This conversation is really making me think about some of the resistance that we get to this work, right? That, having to make statements like qualitative data is data. And that a lot of times when the data that folks are seeing doesn't align with what their personal experience at an organization or in a particular environment has been, that can be really tough. And there are, and we see resistance in that way. We also, with the quantitative side, we also see resistance in terms of like, oh, well, that one's an outlier. That's just a little data point, the kind of like, well, it's got to be like a really big number for me to pay attention to it, kind of a bias. And Angela, I would love for you to talk a little bit about kind of those smaller data points, those outliers, and why we pay attention to them.
Yes, I have so many thoughts on that because that is something we hear. And especially that term outlier, I guess I struggle with because as Brandale keeps talking about, I think DEI work is so important because all of our data are humans. They're all people's experiences. And so to me, even I think it sometimes is a folly that I fall into too, when I'm working with numbers so much as a summary statistic, I have to like think about like these are all people's experiences underlying it as well. And so anyways, to your point about small data points, I mean, for one, like I think we have grown like the way like I think a lot of traditional scholarship or the way we were grown up is like if it's not a majority of the data set, you can write it off. And that is not the way I would say you should be approaching this kind of work. And so for one part, I think it's always important to realize like those with marginalized identities, that just that word marginalized, it can mean that they're like underrepresented in a workspace organization. So by construct, like these are fewer so-called data points right there. But that doesn't mean that we should not weight them just as equally as other identities are not traditionally marginalized. And so keeping that kind of lens in mind when you're looking at either numbers or qualitative data, I think is so important. And I'd really caution against writing off outliers, especially in this kind of work. I think it's so important to really read and understand these experiences. Again, like what Jackie was saying, coming in with an open mind, even if it doesn't match exactly what you have seen or felt, there's a reason why you're asking for this data, and it is to hear them and listen to them. And also because you don't think you know the answer. I think you wouldn't be here trying to solicit other feedback if you thought you already knew the answer. And so all these data points are really important. And I think just making sure that you still elevate those that may have marginalized identities or maybe just smaller groups within your data pools, and making sure you're still treating them with the same kind of so-called importance, unfortunately, that you would lend to maybe a larger portion of the data.
Angela, I love that you said that, although it's data, it's still representative of people, of humans, right? And I think that sometimes we forget about that. I've had to tell clients all the time, like when I'm reporting out focus group data and, they might ask for, well, how many specific people said this or felt this way? And sometimes I have to say, well, even if it's just one person, we still have to validate their experience, right? We still have to recognize that this one individual, although it's only one individual, they still are a member of your team and they still feel like they don't belong. And so that is absolutely worth understanding and addressing. That's why qual data is so important.
Yeah. And I think, when we're talking about things like bias and discrimination in a workplace, in an organization, in a group of any kind, that, sometimes people are kind of looking for like a minimum threshold, which is always a little bit interesting to me because I think I think to the point that you're both making, like, I think we just kind of look at numbers sometimes and forget that these are human beings that we're looking at and their experiences. And it's really easy to say like, okay, well, what number should we be looking for? At what point do we take action? That kind of a thing. And so, shifting people's minds back to that point of saying, well, okay, but if you've got even one person experiencing discrimination in your workplace, that's enough. That's all we need. That's all we need to tell you that you need to take action. So I think, especially in this work, it's so important to look at every single number and every single experience because, for a lot of the things that we're dealing with, it really is and should be completely unacceptable for even one person to be experiencing the things that we're talking about. So I'm seeing a question in the Q&A, which quite honestly is a feature of Zoom I did not realize existed. So thank you, whoever Q&A user. This is new for me. So they said, in academia, people tend to dismiss DEI data, citing that data doesn't meet the rigors of research design. Can you comment on this? How conflating research data versus impact data is problematic? So sorry, I don't know if you all can actually see the Q&A or if that's just us. So that's why I was reading it to you. But I think that is so interesting because, you're looking at our little titles here in Zoom. So Brendel and I both have PhDs. We're both academics. We both teach at universities in addition to working for NOVA. And we both are published in our respective fields. So, from our perspective, the research that we're doing for NOVA, the research that we're doing in the DEI space, and I hope I'm not speaking for you, Brendel, so please feel free to jump in. But, we're doing research with academic rigor. That is the way we are trained to do research. That is the way that we know how to do research. So yeah, kind of this idea that DEI research isn't research or isn't rigorous, isn't in the same way that academic research is. From my perspective, it's the same thing. We're doing rigorous academic research, and we're using research designs that, in different contexts. Were we sharing our clients' data with the world, which we're not, this would be publishable stuff. So Brendel, I'd love to invite your perspective on this too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the unique things that we have with our academic background is also that theoretical understanding, right? And so we kind of have an understanding of organizational dynamics and people dynamics and communication dynamics and all of those theories that can, again, help explain why these trends and phenomenons are existing. And so, yes, we absolutely bring that perspective. And it's unfortunately hard to separate my brain from the academic side to other sides. But that's just how we do data, to Jackie's point. That's how we do research. That's how we've been trained to do research. And so this idea that it's not the same standard is just, it's absurd to me, quite honestly, because, it's just kind of what it is and how our approach is, especially, again, with that theoretical understanding of how these things kind of interact with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Angela, I saw you jump off mute. What do you want to jump in with here?
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think like from the quant side too, I think there's sometimes we do face resistance against the numbers that we were presenting, but like the underlying methods are exactly what you would be using to measure impact and change across any other, whether or not it's a survey or another instrument, like across other disciplines, like the same exact approaches are being applied. So I would say like on the quantitative, like the number side, those methods are the exact same and are of the same rigor and background as what we use it across a lot of other spheres.
Yeah. And I guess, that it's kind of funny that perspective is out there, that DEI data or DEI research isn't real research. Because, I imagine there are other folks out there doing this in ways that are different from the way we do it. And so, perhaps there is some of that out there, but certainly the way that we approach research is with all the levels of academic rigor that we do when we're doing our own research. So, I would love to transition us over to, okay, so what do we do with this data, right? How is it actionable? How do we know what to do with it? How do we decide what to do with it? Angela, I don't know if you want to start us off on this one.
Yeah, I think I'm actually going to kick it off to Brandale. And I was just curious, like we saw on the opening slides, we had a second topic listed there about how do we use data without just checking a box? And again, that's something we hear pretty often, and we get that question too. So I'm curious about your thoughts, Brandale.
Yeah, it is very difficult sometimes, especially when you are working with a client who is very numbers focused, right? And so you give them data, and maybe within the data, you realize that there are a lot of groups who aren't represented in the same amount other groups are, right? And so their mind automatically goes to, okay, well, we need to get more people of color on the team. We need to get more women on the team. And so it's our job to kind of say, yes, that's great. And so it's not always about just checking off the box, just checking or trying to ensure that you're making a quota. You really want to use this data. Again, I keep saying this, you guys are going to get tired of me saying this, but to foster a sense of belonging, to foster a sense of inclusion. Even if you hire additional women or people of color or people from other identity groups, if they come to your team and they don't feel seen, they don't feel validated, they don't feel like they belong, they won't be there for long, right? And so you have to use the data as a starting point. So yes, maybe consider ways that you can recruit and retain more diverse talent, but also ways that you can cultivate an environment to where those individuals want to stay, that where they want to feel like, or they feel like they're part of the team, that they belong there and that they're appreciated. And so it's just a tiny baby step in the journey of really fostering that sense of inclusion. It should absolutely never just be used as, okay, we've hired X amount of women, now we're done, we don't have to worry about that. No, that is just the first step of many in creating this safe space for individuals.
And on that, that's why we collect so much, or when we do our data analysis, that's why we collect other things rather than just demographics. Like, it is so important to understand how other people are feeling about set of, we have like, of course, different statements that we collect experiences on, but for example, like how you feel about inclusion and belonging, just as you said. So like, if it is just really about checking a box, we wouldn't be focusing on all the other data points that we want to collect as well. And so,
absolutely.
go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think that the data can really serve as a foundation for like creating a strategic plan to address the gaps that are identified, right? And so really being intentional about how to identify those things and how to address those things in a way that's extremely comprehensive. And again, that's not just that checkbox approach.
And yeah, to that point, I think we've now heard quite a bit about like quotas and representation and like checking all these boxes. I'm curious, like Jackie, like what can you shed some light on like our approach at Nova?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think quota is one of those words that's got like loads of baggage around it, right? So let's take that with a grain of salt and just understand that quotas have been used in a lot of different ways, many of which are disadvantageous to folks with marginalized identities. But at Nova, our perspective is that you really have to be able to put numbers around what you're doing. So to just say we want a more diverse workforce, or we want a more diverse leadership team, or whatever it is, like that's great, that's a fantastic goal. And you need to be able to put some parameters on that so that when you've gotten there, right? Like, what exactly are you trying to do? Are you trying to increase, marginalized racial and ethnic groups? Are you trying to increase the number of women and non-binary folks? Are you trying to increase, different types of socioeconomic status or ability? Or, what are the ways in which you are looking to diversify? And what are you trying to get to? How will you know when you've achieved your goals? A lot of that can come into, especially, so take looking at your leadership team, for example. If you say, okay, we got to diversify our leadership team, start by looking at your employee base. So, what is the general makeup in terms of social identity of your employee base? How about your communities, the communities where you work, the communities where your folks live, the communities where your customers live? So, kind of think through, what are the numbers that are out there, or what would be appropriate and attainable, and really get us the level of diversity that we need to make better business decisions, right? Because when you're putting numbers around this, it's great to say like, okay, we need to add 3 women to our leadership team or something like that. But think through why you're doing that. It's not just for the sake of adding women to your leadership team. It's because you understand that having a more diverse group at the leadership level, at all levels of your organization, really helps you make better business decisions. You get more perspectives in the mix. It might be a little bit of a harder road, right? When you have a lot of different perspectives, you end up getting the best product, but was it super fun to get there all the time? Would it have been easier if everybody just thought the same thing and said, yeah, let's do that? Like, sure, that would be easy, but that's not how you get the best results from your organization. So really thinking through why you want to put parameters on this, why you want numbers, and then what kind of numbers are reasonable to get you to the goals that you want for your organization. That's really our approach, that you've got to be able to put numbers on it. And it might feel a little bit uncomfortable to say, okay, we're going to put a percentage of our workforce that we want to be certain racial or ethnic groups or whatever it is. We want a certain percentage to have certain abilities. That might feel uncomfortable, and a lot of your personal DEI journey, your professional DEI journey is sitting with some of that discomfort and really interrogating why this makes you uncomfortable and why this is a hard thing to do. And so that's kind of the way that we approach it at Nova. And Brandel, I saw you jump off mute a minute ago, so jump in here.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I love that you're saying that you have to understand the why behind, filling these quotas, right? I think so often, sometimes people don't understand the why. That's why that qual piece is so important, right? So if you have the data and you know that there needs to be more female representation on your board, and you also know that women feel marginalized within your team, you understand the why. You understand that representation matters. And if their female team members see women represented on the board, that can help bridge that gap of not feeling connected and not feeling like they belong. And so understanding that why is so absolutely important.
And we know that there's so much research out there that's back that having a diversity of voices across all levels is so important. So this isn't, I think what Jackie was saying with that kind of negative connotation with the word quota, we know this is backed up also by a lot of research. And so with that, I think we've also touched a little bit about, I think I hear threads towards intersectionality and how that also is so important. And so that's something we also just want to talk about too. And from the quant side, I do think it's always so important to have intersectionality in mind when you're looking at what you're saying about quotas and representation across a lot of different social categories and a lot of different identities. And so a lot of that also should be considered when you're looking at your data, that individual experiences, what we talked about earlier with outliers, that isn't just because when we're looking at these outliers that they belong only to one racial or ethnic group. This overlaps a lot with what their gender identity is, what their socioeconomic class is. And that's also why I really want to caution against dismissing again those what we've been calling outliers. And so all of this also comes in play with representation and quotas, and that people can belong to multiple identities or multiple different categories. And so when you're setting a percentage, I think I've sometimes heard oh, there's no way we can do that. It's a lot of people belong to multiple categories, and there is a way to work with all of these different identities to really look at what representation looks like across multiple different, multiple different social categories here. And so, Brandon, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on this as well, and I'd love to hear them.
Absolutely. So, Angela, you are speaking to my researcher spirit right now, because intersectionality is so important in research, right? I know for myself as a Black woman, those identities play a huge part in how I show up in the world, how I experience the world, and how people experience me in the world. And so in taking that same perspective in the data we collect and the data that we analyze, we have to always understand that there are different perspectives and identities and experiences that one individual can have, and that absolutely can shape or should shape how we understand and how we analyze the data, right? And so understanding just that intersectionality and the complex identities of an individual, and also knowing that no one is a monolith, right? No group behaves and acts the same. Like we make these generalizations without realizing, kind of to the point that we made earlier, that these people are human, right? These people have separate experiences that they're bringing to the table. And so that's why that qual piece is so important, because I think it helps us understand that a little bit better, and just how all of these identity groups work together to make up an individual and make up their experience in the world.
Thank you so much for that, Brenda. Or Jackie, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Nope, go for it.
Oh, sorry. Okay, just wanted to make sure. I was like, I mean, I know we keep talking about analyzing DEI data. So I was like, we might as well also dive into that. That was also that third circle that we had in our initial presentation. I want to make sure that we at least hit these three and then touch on other topics. And so I can go ahead. Brandel, did you have something to say there?
Yeah, no, Angela, I was just going to ask you, like, your perspective as a quant researcher. What are your eyes? What are your lens of analysis look like when you're looking at DEI data?
Yeah, and so there's always so much we can do. So I think that part of it's also like learning and figuring out how to prioritize what you're really interested in digging into with your data. But before we go into that, I think one thing that we do at Nova, I'm sure is not surprising, is we do disaggregate a lot of our quantitative data. And what that means is taking that whole data set that you have and then also splitting it across what we call data cuts, like usually along one sort of variable. So for example, splitting and looking at the responses to a specific question based on racial and ethnic identity or gender identity, and each of those variables, one in silo, but also how they interact with one another, as we talked about with intersectionality. And of course, this is just so important. It does take more time, but it doesn't have to be particularly complex either to really get some good insights. And so when we're talking again about those data cuts, like let's say looking at your data in groups of different gender identities, you can see different trends sometimes and see larger gaps across different categories. And I think that's so important because it's easy to look at the population as a whole, your data set as a whole, and seeing one trend. But once you dive in and do these data cuts, you'll see that some of the overall trends or some of the underlying trends really can be hidden. And a lot of this, again, is coming to those small groups of data points. If there is one group or one group of data that is taking up a smaller proportion of your overall data set, the trends with those gaps, or not gaps, actually, maybe you're seeing something great there, are being hidden when you're looking at the data set as a whole. And so it sounds kind of messy, but I think what I'm getting at is like data analysis. I think some people have in their mind that it's very, very clean, like you do A, B, C, and D. But actually, like my experience is like it's kind of trial and error. Like I have a hypothesis. I'm gonna go try to do my data set one way, cut it a different way, looking at that, and then I find, oh wow, there's like a whole new question I have, or it's something that confirms what I believe in. And I think what we said at the beginning too, or Brenda, I loved your opening thing of like, if you just say research says this, people will like give it credence. That's what I feel too sometimes. Like, okay, even if I'm just confirming my hypothesis, I do have data to back it up now. And so data doesn't always have to be about like finding brand new and very, I would say like crazy conclusions. And sometimes it's so useful just to see your hypothesis being confirmed. And so there's a lot I can get into this, but I think going back and just saying like, you can do a lot of complex analytics with quantitative data. You can go beyond averages and correlations. You can do regressions. We have a lot of different models that you can do. But also, if we really want to cut it down to the basics, like you can get a lot of information out of just looking at, for example, like average scores to certain pieces of your, if you are doing a survey, certain pieces of your survey. And so I will also open it up to you and Jackie too. I know there's a lot I can say about this.
So Angela, I have a follow-up question to that. Is there a tool that you usually run? You mentioned regression and things like that. Is there something that you usually lean to more often than not when you're analyzing DEI data?
Yeah, I think it's an iterative process. I think usually I do start with the so-called quote unquote basics, but like averages and correlations. But then depending on what I see there, again, with that iterative process, I might use regressions to help like inform another data cut. or use a regression to help inform another different analysis. So it really is not so cut and dry of like A, then B, then C. And with that, other ideas can spark. So with intersectionality, if we do see there are enough data points, perhaps in like across two variables, we might also run that analysis as well. And it's just so dependent on, I think what you can hear is, what is the purpose of what you're analyzing, and also really understanding your data. I think the point of what I'm also trying to make is it's not a one size fits all approach with analyzing any sort of data set. And that's definitely true also of DEI data.
And I think like on a practical level, it gets to what Ishani dropped in the comments, which I apologize for getting your name wrong. I'm typing quickly here. But, it's when you have organizations or groups that have a lot of folks who share the same social identities, perhaps those are dominant identities. Like if you've got a majority white organization, you've got fewer BIPOC folks in the organization. If you're just looking at averages, then everything might look just fine because the people with the dominant identities are having a great experience at the organization because everything's kind of working for them. But what Angela's talking about is really digging into, okay, so who are the groups, if any, that are having a really different experience at the organization? And so on a really practical level, it helps us understand the experiences of different groups within the organization so that we can say, not only from a qualitative perspective and the stories that these folks are telling about their experiences, but also from a quantitative perspective, we're seeing statistically significant differences in the way that folks with XYZ identities are experiencing your organization. And so, we're kind of able to tell that story both ways and really make sure that we're really amplifying the voices of the folks who are having those experiences and that we're honoring the data that they're providing, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to say, just because, if you're answering strongly disagree to something, that's not getting lost in our giant wave of folks with majority identities in the organization, that data point is being honored. Your response, we're hearing you, we're listening, and we're doing something with it. So I think it helps organizations on that practical level too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to kind of shift gears, still using in the same lens of data analysis, but also as we think about DEI data, we have to take into consideration the critical perspective, right? And so I know the term critical has become a buzzword in recent years, but to get to the core of what it means to look at something critically, it's really just to understand all of the factors that are at play that kind of help perpetuate the dynamics, right? And so when I think of the critical perspective and using my critical lens to analyze data, I'm really looking at it from an approach of, okay, who's benefiting from this situation? Who are the individuals that are a little bit disadvantaged in this situation? And what are the practices at play that might perpetuate this power imbalance? And what can we do to bring more light and visibility to this? And for those that are disenfranchised in the situation, what are some continuing factors that might contribute to why they are disenfranchised? And so when I think of critical perspective, it's really just using that lens to understand the power dynamics that are contributing to the imbalances, to discrimination, to all of those feelings of exclusion and discriminatory actions that might happen in a team environment. So I love to use the critical perspective and critical lens when analyzing data, because it can really help, again, unearth those experiences, especially for marginalized communities. That critical perspective is so crucial when we're thinking about the power imbalances and, simply put, those that have privilege and power versus those that do not have privilege and power in certain situations and team dynamics. We know historically certain groups have that, especially in the workplace, especially for those that don't have the same access to education and things like that. And so we have to take all of those factors into account when we're collecting data, when we're analyzing data, when we're recognizing themes and trends. So if you see a theme and trend, really asking yourself why, and then asking yourself why again, and then asking yourself why again, to get to the root cause of what that theme or trend may be. And so that critical perspective is something that I think goes hand in hand with DEI data.
I love how you describe that, Brandel, because I think critical is another one of those words that's got a lot of baggage with it these days. And so, just really thinking of it in terms of like asking that why and digging, and, it's things that people would do anyway and would want to do anyway. But then putting that critical label on it kind of makes it like, ooh, I don't know about this anymore. But really, when you think at a foundational level, what we're doing as researchers, it's not hard to get on board with it, right? We're trying to figure out what's going on. We're asking good questions to get there. So I really appreciate that perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's really just about uncovering things, right? That's all we do, to your point, Jackie, as researchers. We're just trying to uncover, we're trying to understand, and we're trying to learn and grow from what we find.
Yeah, and to that, I really agree with all of that, because the quantitative side, like, to me, it's just a starting point. Like, you need all the things that you're mentioning, because I can give you a number, 4.2, but what does that mean? What are you going to do with it? And so we really do need all the other things that you and Jackie have both been talking about.
Absolutely. And that kind of makes me think about the role of the researcher in the research process. So, Jackie, tell me a little bit about how you bring yourself to analyzing data and collecting data, and whether or not objectivity is a thing for you when you're analyzing data.
Yeah, I love that question, because objectivity is not a thing when you're analyzing data or really doing anything else, right? Because if you think about it, we can try to be objective, we can try to be impartial, all of those things, and we are human beings with biases. And DEI work is not about erasing all of your biases and getting rid of them and being completely impartial, because that's, number one, just not possible. But also, that doesn't make sense in the context of what we're trying to do. So being a researcher, understanding that I'm also a human being, I've got biases, and it's my job to understand what those biases are and interrupt them before they get in the way of my analysis. So it's not so much impartiality, it's not so much objectivity, it's taking my humanness and understanding it and interrupting bias when it happens. And am I perfect at that? No, absolutely not. I don't think that any of us is. The NOVA team, we really think it's important to have a research team that has a variety of different social identities and backgrounds and perspectives, because we want to make sure that we're kind of able to check each other's biases, right? We're all checking our own biases, but we're also trying to check each other's biases. And so it really is important for us as researchers to kind of understand the role that we have and understand what we are bringing to the process. Shani, I love this question. Speak some more about interrupting biases. So for me, as a white middle-class woman, I grew up in a kind of suburban Chicago, upper middle class, or middle class probably, upbringing, where, for me, a lot of my personal interrupting biases comes in the terms of unlearning. So understanding where I grew up with things that I just absolutely believed to be true, these dominant narratives in society that I completely ascribed to, I totally took for granted, I never questioned, I never even thought to, never even occurred to me to question. And so throughout my personal DEI journey, it's been a lot of kind of unlearning those dominant narratives and finding ways to uncover and amplify the counter narratives that are out there. And really, especially when I'm looking at qualitative data, I can learn so much from other people's stories and experiences. And I think that has helped me personally to be able to recognize and amplify counter narratives in a way that helps me help organizations understand the experiences that their employees are having. So Brandel, I'd love to hear your perspective on this too.
Yeah, no, I always say that, like, building that cultural competency is so important in recognizing those biases that we all have, like you said, and being able to intercept them before they impact or impair our judgment. And I think it's also important to note that we all have biases, right? And they're not always necessarily inherently good or bad, but we have to recognize them. We have to know that they exist, so it doesn't interfere with how we research and understand the data that we're collecting. So it doesn't impact how we interact with people who we perceive to be different from us, right? And so it to Jackie's point, I think it's just an ongoing learning journey. We have to unlearn those things that we were conditioned to believe growing up. We have to expose ourselves to different people's experiences, and we just have to be committed to learning and being committed to really kind of lowering our guard and in embracing other people's experiences.
All that really resonates with me. And again, this is also why we're having a conversation about it today, right? Like there's not, again, like a perfect answer for how to approach your data set without in an objective, like so-called objective way. And so I think we talked about a little bit like perfection. I think I heard the word perfect earlier. And this also just, again, is something I hear with when I'm analyzing quantitative data. With this, like in particular, I know NOVA does issue surveys. And what we hear sometimes is like, oh, but we're missing some data or missing some folks in our data for those that didn't respond to the survey, or there's like a ton of follow-up questions like, can you tell me about A, B, C, and D about why your data shows this? And so, of course, I think like all these are really valid questions or conversations to have. I also want like to say like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. Like, I think even if you aren't getting 100% of responses from your so-called population of what you want to respond to the survey, like you probably already have a lot of like insights from the data that you do have. And so I also like want to caution against people of like, I love follow-up questions. I'm definitely want to fall into that trap of those. Like, I want to know more about why A is A, and I want to go down all these rabbit holes. But when it comes down to it, like, I also think remember, like, what would I do even if I had the answer to that question? Is there something so different that I would prioritize if I knew the answer to that follow-up question? If the answer is yes, maybe I do prioritize that in my analysis. But also, I think keep in mind, we know that there's like a set number of resources and what your action items might look like, and being able to prioritize and also see like what is more realistic and what is actually like the biggest action items that we have that are worth it to really dive deep into these analyses. And so with that, I think it's also just, again, focusing that there are a lot of probably really decent insights and decent places you can start, even if you don't have 100% of your data. And also, let me just be clear. I don't think I've ever seen where you're going to get every single person to really answer a survey or your full population. Like that doesn't happen in research, honestly. And so there are very few scenarios I would say we've gotten everyone that we wanted. And so keeping all that in mind and saying like your questions are probably the exact same as another person coming into it with like, oh, we don't have all our data. What can we do with it? There's still a lot of good places you can start. And maybe like what we're talking about it, benchmarking or year over year stuff, then maybe your goal next year is to get a larger portion of people to respond to the survey. Or if you do see like one group that is a significantly less response rate, really targeting outreach on that end. And so before I go into year over year data, I just want to check Jackie or Brandon. I know you two work on this too. If there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, I just so appreciate your comments on, the perfect data, Angela, because and I think we don't need to necessarily go down this rabbit hole, but like, let's talk about perfection as one of the things that is really upholding cultures of white supremacy in a lot of organizations. This idea that like things have to be perfect and that is the expectation. And I think a lot of times the way we experience this need for perfection is as a form of resistance to DEI work in general. That, when we're getting that type of resistance where someone is really pursuing the perfect data set, it's what tends to be underlying that is looking for a loophole, right? Like looking for a way to discount the research and the data and the stories and the experiences that are in front of them because it's not perfect. And so, if you all are doing research, I'm talking to the wider group here, if you all are doing research in your organization and you're getting that type of resistance, really think about where that might be coming from and why a person might be pushing for that level of perfection, and kind of better understand what someone is asking you to do. I'm seeing a couple of Q&As here too. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to stomp on you, Angela.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. I saw a few questions. I actually think, Jackie, if you might have some comments on.
Yeah. So the first one, how effective are pulse surveys, in your opinion, to measure employee sentiment, feedback, specific issues and events? I think pulse surveys can be a really useful tool because, we want to understand what's going on with folks. We don't want to do pulse surveys to a point where we've got survey fatigue, right? So if you're doing pulse surveys about everything like DEI stuff and other stuff, and let's talk about our strategy and let's talk about our benefits, like if we're doing research to that scale, then you start to get people who are just angry that the survey is there to begin with. And one of the things that we really try to do is not make people angry about DEI surveys before they even start. So be thoughtful about the ways that you're seeking feedback and the reasons that you choose to do a pulse survey. And a lot of what is behind that is, okay, what are you going to do with it? Is it just seeking, your execs kind of are curious what people are thinking? That might be okay, but why? Why are they curious? And what are they going to do about it if they get answer X or answer Y from the employee group? So I think that's a big part of it. I'd love to invite Angela and Brandel here to comment on this too.
Yeah, no, I love pulse surveys because, like I mentioned before, it tells us where we need to start, right? It kind of gives us a glimpse in the areas of opportunity, where we should go from here and kind of build from there. So I absolutely think, given in the right context, pulse surveys can definitely be useful for building your DEI capacity.
I don't have much to add on that. I think you two have covered it. I also did see another question, and I'll read that out loud. And Jackie and Renee, please start off with your thoughts. So, speaking to the humanity of the researcher, how do you navigate, quote, hard to read data that can be triggering to you as a researcher who might hold marginalized identities? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know that I have an answer. I know it is tough. And, as a Black woman in this space doing this research, I have heard and seen data that has really just stopped me in my place, right? And sometimes it's hard to disconnect, especially when, you hold the identities of those sharing their experiences. And so you can kind of feel those emotions. You can very easily put yourself in that person's shoes. And so I don't have an answer to that. I know that that is a part of this research world. And I think that brings value to analyzing the data, right? Because I can empathize with that experience, or maybe even have that same experience myself, I can shed even more perspective and even more insight as to why that experience should be elevated, should be validated, and provide a perspective on how to address that situation. And so in terms of disconnecting from a space so it doesn't trigger you, I don't have an answer there. I would just say try to use it as fuel to really provide that understanding and perspective and provide the solution for whatever is being addressed.
And I would just say, from the NOVA perspective too, we're really conscious of this, and there's not a ton we can do with survey data. For example, if we've got open-ended responses for a survey, we're asking a researcher to do that. We don't know what's going to be in there. So we don't have many protections in place, unfortunately. But when it comes to things like interviews and focus groups, when we're doing these within organizations or within other broader stakeholder groups, we're really thoughtful about who we think is ending up in these focus groups, who we're talking to from an interview basis. And if we have any red flags in terms of feedback that these folks might have, we really try to protect our researchers. And for focus groups, for example, if we're doing identity specific focus groups, we try to choose a researcher who shares some of the same identities as the folks in the room, to try to create a safer space for the folks in the room, but also a safer space for the researcher. So, a while back, we had an organization that wanted to do a focus group with people who are actively in opposition to DEI work. And so, what we did was for that particular focus group, we wanted to make sure that it was facilitated by somebody who holds as many dominant identities as possible, because we were anticipating that that was what we would get in the room. It absolutely was. And we wanted to make sure that we protected our researchers with marginalized identities who are actively experiencing oppression every day of their lives, to not have to be in that space where people are talking about why they disagree with DEI work. So, we try to be thoughtful about that, but I'll just say, this is hard work. This is hard to hear and hard to read, some of the things that kind of come across in our research studies, and we do the best we can, but unfortunately it can be kind of an emotional journey to be a researcher on this team and doing this work.
And I'm seeing a Shani, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, comment in the chat, and just the importance of practicing self-care and holding space. Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Anything else to add on the social identity approach?
Yeah, I was just going to go with social identity, Brandel, because I was thinking, we keep throwing around this term social identity. Let's talk about that in case some of the folks here are not as familiar as that. So social identities in general are some of the identities that we hold that really have ties to systems and power dynamics in larger structures in life, right? So it's things like gender, ability, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, it's things like that. Not so much things like I'm a mom, I'm a runner. Those are more personal identities. So when we're talking about research through this lens of social identity, what we're talking about is really digging into the way that identity influences experiences and perspectives. And so when we're doing surveys, when we're doing focus groups, when we're doing interviews, we're really thoughtful about the identities that folks hold. And especially in survey research, we have a set of questions that, folks might refer to them as the demographic questions, but we call them the social identity questions because, it's not about fitting folks into a particular box. It's not about looking at, categories that are maybe prescribed by your organization or something. It's really about, we want you to describe yourself the way that you identify. How do you describe yourself? What words do you use? And so we're constantly evolving the answer choices that we put in that section, but we always have a prefer to self-describe section in each of our social identity questions, because we really want folks to have that freedom to describe themselves the way that they do. We don't do surveys where we go through an organization's HRIS system or something like that, where somewhere on the back end, you can absolutely trace who's saying what, because everybody's got their own unique link, because we're just tapping into the HR data to understand people's department or their race or their gender or things like that. That's really contrary to the way that NOVA approaches research, because we are all about identity and the way folks describe themselves, not the data that an organization may have on file for you. Because a lot of times the data points your employer has about you are just not quite right. They're not really the way that you define yourself, because you had to pick a box, or worse, somebody picked a box for you. And so it's really important to us to have that lens of social identity, for that to be how we are cutting our data or organizing our themes when we're doing the qualitative work. So, social identity is just a really critical part of the way that we approach research at NOVA.
Thank you Oh, go ahead, Brandale.
No, I was just going to say, it's funny. Anytime I have to take like a survey and I see a question that like really is considerate of different people's identities, I always like take a picture of it, because I'm like, yes, this is perfect, because you have to understand people don't always fit into the standard boxes that are usually provided in these demographic questions, right? And so when I see it, my heart just always smiles that, okay, somebody who designed the survey really gets it, because it's so important for people just to feel seen in something as simple as, what gender do you identify as, and being able to either self-describe or see how they identify reflected in the answer choices. So I love that you said that, Jackie.
Yeah, all of this is so, I love what you're both saying too. And it's just so important about like the safety and protection of identities, as I know like you both have talked quite a bit about. And then so like also I think from the quantitative perspective too, what comes to my mind is like I always approach like our data with like who is responding, who isn't responding, what is missing. And I always have a keen eye on missing data. That's a pretty big interest of mine. And again, while I'm saying that, I still want to like know you don't need all your people to respond to a survey to have action items already. But keeping that in mind, I do think it's always important to reflect upon like, is there a group that you know that exists at your organization that you don't see in your results? And like, for example, does that mean dismissing your entire findings, but then maybe for the next year, like what can you do differently? Along with that, I think this also relates to something we talked about earlier of like why it's so important to disaggregate or do like your different data cuts so that you can see if there are any gaps that you know of that are not showing up in your data set. And so that's just a little bit there. I wonder if there's anything else, Brandon or Jackie, you want to add about like safety and the protection of identities in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I love everything you've been saying about disaggregating the data because I think that's so important. And again, from our perspective, we're not going to do a data cut or break out a data set if we don't have enough people in a particular group. And that is one of the primary ways that we are exercising participant protection. So, for example, if you've only got 2 people who have a particular identity, and we're going to show you like, oh yeah, here's the average response for people with this identity, then oh my gosh, everybody knows who said what. and that is not the spirit with which we are approaching the data. We want people to feel safe when they are taking our surveys, participating in our focus groups or our interviews. So for our surveys, at least, we set a minimum threshold of 10. So if we've got 10 people who have a particular identity who have responded to the question, then we feel like we can provide a data cut. Sometimes we up that to 15, depending on the particular organization and the different identities and power dynamics that are at play. And it looks like Tian, I hope I'm saying that right. I think I just answered your question. We do set that minimum threshold at 10 or 15. So that's one of the ways that we are really focused on participant protection. Another way is honestly what I was saying before about we're not going to go through your HRIS system. We're going to provide one anonymous link that goes out to everybody, and you identify yourself in any ways that you want to. All the questions are optional, and we don't show our raw data sets to our clients. So that I think is a little bit hard for people to get their heads around at the beginning. They're like, well, wait a second, it's our data, and it is your data. We totally get that. But for certain people within your organization, if they are answering 1, sometimes even 2, a couple of those identity questions, then all of a sudden their responses become completely transparent because they might be the only within the organization. Or if you triangulate any 2 responses, they might be the only person who has those 2 identities. So when we're talking about how important identity and intersectionality are, we want to make sure that people feel safe responding to those questions so that we can get real insights into their experiences and honor those experiences without revealing the person's identity to their employer. We really hold that sacred, and we make sure that you've got your org charts, you've got your list of your employees, who everybody is. We've got the data set and we don't know who everybody is. So even with any amount of information about somebody's social identity, we still couldn't possibly figure out who they are because we don't know your folks. So that type of bright line between the employee data and the data set really helps us assure true anonymity and confidentiality as well.
Thank you for all of that, Jackie. And I am noting the time. I know we have 10 minutes left, and this is perfect. I know we have a few closing slides, but again, people, if you have any other questions, please put them into the Q&A and chat right now too.
Yeah, we really appreciate that you've been doing that all the way along. That's been really fun to see what your questions are and to be able to kind of talk through some of this stuff. So I'm seeing another question in Q&A here. We struggle determining sentiments of Black A respondents from people of color. Black A numbers are so low. Can you provide guidance or thoughts about this? Yeah, I'll pitch that over to Angela first, but certainly we can I'm happy to jump into.
I think that relates to your other question too, of like, is there a strict number of people that we can all point to and say like that is the minimum needed? And so the short answer is like, no, there's not one thing. The JAG said for the most part is 10 or 15. I wonder if you're saying like those numbers are lower. And for us, like perhaps that's still coming through the qualitative data points that are still being analyzed. There's still other avenues, even if we can't share out like the average of those. Let's just say it's even just 2 people. We might not share out the average of those 2 folks. We know their data is still coming in other ways. It's still flowing into the overall data set. There's still qualitative data pieces that we can look at. And hopefully, I think this goes into like some of the action items then, as we've talked about representation and hoping to hit at least some number that at your organization or group that you feel safe in reporting those results in. So those are my initial thoughts. Jackie, not sure if there's anything you would add.
Yeah, I know. And this is such a challenge, Shannon. We always, we run into this all the time because we work with organizations of all shapes and sizes. And so, sometimes what we'll do is try to combine a couple of different groups, even though we understand that the experiences are not quite the same. We'll kind of cut it on our end to see how it shakes out with the actual numbers. But then before we show the client, we roll them up a little bit so that we can at least get a minimum group of 10. And then we can kind of talk through some of those nuances and differences, knowing what the data was showing without putting actual hard numbers on it. And so that's kind of, again, where we try to reach into the storytelling and the experiences that folks are having, and not necessarily having to rely on just quantitative numbers. Any other questions? We'd love to hear more from you. And thank you, moderator.
Yes, I was like, I'll just say that too. If you want to come off mute to share reflection or ask a question, please use the hand raise button and we'll enable your microphone access.
All right, well then I have a question for you all. So, I mean, at Nova, as we said, I've been at Nova for the past 5 years. Angela's been here for the last 2. And, even over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of changes in the ways that organizations are approaching DEI data and their need for research. So I'm curious, especially since 2020, because that's really kind of ended up being a pivotal point in DEI work. Since 2020, how has research or data or measurement changed at your organization? Or has it?
And as people are responding, I know since we're in this space, we've seen, recent news stories about how organizations are now shifting away from focusing on DEI initiatives. And I can't help but cringe because I know how disastrous this is going to be when we look back 2-3 years from now and see the impact of removing DEI officers and not having those types of initiatives to provide a safe space for individuals. And I think it's going to be, we'll be able to measure the impact for sure by data.
Yeah, and thank you for jumping in the chat here, Shani, too. It's all about the data, whether it's DEI or otherwise. Yeah. Understanding the people we work with or our customers is important to all future success. Yeah, and I love that. I love that perspective too, that it's not just, we do a lot of work in organizations, right? That is really important, critical work. And there are other stakeholders involved in a lot of what everyone is doing. And so understanding that you don't have to limit the scope of your DEI research to just your employees, being thoughtful about what other groups are involved and what we might need to understand about those groups in order to effectively move forward with a more inclusive culture or more inclusive product offering or whatever it is that you're working toward. Just really thinking about your research in terms of like, let's not limit ourselves, but let's really think about all of the communities that come together here and how we might structure some research to better understand them and their experiences. And I'm seeing Beth in here. Thank you. A newly established DEI council at our company. That's great. Just on our first survey to gather data. Yay. I love it. And prior to setting up the council, you had an outside consultant come in to do some benchmarking. Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting how things change over time too. I mean, depending on when the benchmarking interviews happened, when your survey took place, a lot happens in the world pretty quickly. And a lot of what we see in DEI response data is tied to current events and current experiences, but it's also tied a lot to historical events and historical experiences, and people who have been with an organization for a long time kind of have that broader spectrum of time. So yeah, Beth, I hope you'll stay in touch with us and let us know how that's going, because that sounds like you're in a really, really interesting spot right now.
I also see we have a question. So is it possible to share an example of a pulse survey? I may have missed it, and this is really intriguing.
Ooh, I like that question. I'm happy to jump in, but if either one of you
Go
wants
for
to
Go for it.
I just keep talking. Yeah, so a pulse survey, the idea there is that it's a really quick, between 1 and 3 question survey that's on a really highly specific targeted topic. So typically, if you're doing a big DEI survey, I mean, I say big in the sense of like, it'll take you between 7 and 10 minutes, right? But also but a pulse survey is just designed to be super quick, get an impression, get a quick read on what's going on. Sometimes folks will put these up if you have an intranet that is pretty active, popping it into one of the spaces on your intranet so that folks, as they're navigating through their work, they can just kind of like click a button and answer the question, or emailing it out, that kind of a thing. That's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about a pulse survey. So usually they're around a really specific type of question or issue, or we just need to know like this one piece of information from everyone. You'll structure a little bit of research around that. And then Rodney says you started your new DEI program. That is awesome. That is awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. So I'm seeing we have 3 minutes left. Now is your moment. If you've been sitting on a question or a comment throughout this session, I know we've done a lot of talking. So we would love to hear from you. If you've got something you want to drop in the chat, or as our administrator said, you can do the raise hand function. That should be along the bottom of your screen. You can raise your hand and we'll get you off mute for a second. But as we're kind of looking to close out, I hope that you all have had an opportunity to kind of get some more insights today. I hope you've had fun listening to us talk. I've certainly had a good time. But would love to just kind of talk about like what comes next year. So I'm going to get my screen back up. So in general, where do we go from here? We've talked a lot about data. We've talked a lot about research, and the way NOVA specifically does research, but also, kind of the theoretical underpinnings that are behind it, and the ways that we approach this field. And really, when we talk about where we go from here, we hope that you all will start to, embrace this critical mindset of really being thoughtful and digging deep and looking for the power structures and looking for who is benefiting here, and really digging into the nuances of your particular organization, or like we said, your communities or your stakeholder groups, and just raising awareness in general of the ways that you can learn about and amplify folks' experiences through research, through data, as we always advocate for, both quantitative and qualitative. Use that mixed methods approach, let one inform the other, and really get a better understanding of what's going on, because that way you will know what you want to change, how you want to change it, and what it'll look like once it's changed. So full circle here, back to the topic at hand today. If you don't measure it, you can't change it. We are advocates of that perspective, and advocates of learning and growing and storytelling around DEI data and doing this type of research. Angela or Brandel, do you want to say anything as we kind of close out here?
No, nothing other than I've really enjoyed having this conversation today. I learned a lot, especially from you, Angela, from that quant end. So I just appreciate your expertise, and it's an honor to share the floor with you both intelligent women.
No, thank you. This has been wonderful. And again, I really appreciate everyone who's been engaging too. Like, this has been so great to hear from everyone who has been listening in, and it's been great to see where you are at in your journey as well.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.